he'll be like, oh, you need some heat to start the flood going. And then it's like, this is the heat problem. This is the thing that destroys young Earth creationism because it vaporizes the granitic crust of the Earth several dozen times over. That's what happens if you speed up nuclear decay, it turns out, and also zoom the continents around atop the mantle at race car speeds.
Here's the other thing. What do you think, what James Torr will say is the chirality problem? That these amino acids, 19 out of 20 of them, have to be left-handed. So he thinks that's a killer. Do you think that's a killer, the chirality problem?
Evidently. See, I was really looking forward. There was a caller that was on hold, or that called in, and their call screen, their name was Gina, and they said that Matt is a chicken.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching. Most of the content on my channel is supported by generous patrons, but made available for free to the entire world. If you support that, please consider adding your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates. This clip, however, is from one of the mini programs that I do on YouTube on The Line. And if you liked it, feel free to visit, like, subscribe, and watch The Line Network live. Thank you.
William's pronouns are he, him, is spiritual and wants to talk to Erika about whether she's convinced in endogenous retroviruses are proof of creation or not proof of creation. I'm confused, William. Which one are you asking?
Hey, you think you're confused? No. When I heard that endogenous retroviruses were one of the best evidences for evolution, that us in chimpanzees had a common ancestor, and we have these endogenous viruses, retroviruses, on the same place in our genome, I thought, oh my gosh, slam dunk for evolution. But then I listened to Standing for Truth, and Donnie said,
I knew you were going to say that.
Okay,
Sorry,
well,
continue.
let me say what he said, that these have immunological benefits. They help in embryology, in embryological development, and they suppress tumors. What do you think, Erika?
William, I love that you called and asked this. And I knew the second I checked the call, right, the second I looked up there, and I'm sorry for interrupting you for this, the second I saw that it said proof of creation, I was thinking in my head, who would say that? And I was like, oh, I know who would say that. Donnie of Standing for Truth would say that. And I know this guy, he's been making this argument for a very long time. And the reason is because endogenous retroviruses are such convincing support for evolutionary theory, and in a way that is so intuitive to most people, right? Because, viruses insert themselves into your genome, right? These endogenous retroviruses are basically the fossils of viruses, for lack of a better term, that are found in your genome. And they are shared in such a way, because they've inserted themselves, sequentially back in time, that they reflect consistent consensus phylogenies when you look at the entirety of the genome. Case in point, the point of all of this being that it's like, okay, either we share a common ancestor with the organisms, in a nested hierarchical pattern that these endogenous retroviruses support, or everybody just so happens to get the same endogenous retroviral infection at the same place, at the same time, and then those retrovirus areas suffered the same mutations in the same way. The probability is just astronomically small. So that's the case for endogenous retroviruses. Now, I've heard Donnie, or Standing for Truth, make the case that actually endogenous retroviruses aren't just support for creationism, but they're not even viruses, because they do things in the genome. All right. Some of them do. Some endogenous retroviruses have been accepted. They've been sort of gained a function that is useful to us in either immunology or with development or this, that, or the other thing. But what I am always asking Donnie, and what I've wondered since the start of him starting to make this an argument, is what about all of the endogenous retroviruses that don't do any of that stuff? What about all the full or partial endogenous retroviruses that have no function at all? Right? Why do we see this nested hierarchy? And you can ask the same question with non-functional DNA. As to whether or not they're viruses, why do they look like viruses then? Why do these endogenous retroviruses look exactly like viruses? And not just any virus, retroviruses specifically. HIV is a specific type of retrovirus. It uses an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. And it's like you find these same signatures in these endogenous retroviruses. They look like viruses. They act like viruses do. And in fact, endogenous retroviruses are like pretty well understood because some of them actually do have these functions and most of them don't. And look, they replicate the same exact phylogeny or the family tree that you get when you do it with full genomes, right? So when I've talked to Donnie very briefly about this in the past, I've said, okay, those are the challenges you face. One, you have to show that every single endogenous retrovirus has a function. Two, you have to have a better explanation for what they are. Why do they look exactly like viruses if they're not, in fact, viruses? And three, why did they form the same nested hierarchy that the full genome does, showing that humans and chimpanzees are one another's closest living relatives, followed by the gorilla, followed by the orangutan, followed by the gibbons, and so on and so forth? So no, the long and short of that is endogenous retroviruses are not excellent evidence for creationism. But to be perfectly honest with you, Donnie will tell you that hominin fossils are great evidence for creationism. So it's like, everything to him is evidence for creationism. Until I talk to him, and then he cools it on that topic until he thinks I've forgotten about him, and then he brings it up months later when he thinks I'm not paying attention.
Well, are you frustrated because in his mind, he's written a book on this, that these were created during Creation Week, and that you shouldn't even call them viruses, that they should be called God's little helpers or whatever. I don't know. Is it frustrating to you that something that seems like a slam dunk is not to them, but they feel it's a proof of God's creation? Is that frustrating?
Brother, that's one of the least frustrating things that Donnie does, like as far as argument wise, because I've heard him do that with radioactive decay, right? I mean, he'll be like, oh, you need some heat to start the flood going. And then it's like, this is the heat problem. This is the thing that destroys young Earth creationism because it vaporizes the granitic crust of the Earth several dozen times over. That's what happens if you speed up nuclear decay, it turns out, and also zoom the continents around atop the mantle at race car speeds. Like, I've said this before about Donnie, and this applies to virtually all young Earth creationists that I encounter. Not all of them, but the vast majority of them. It's not about a right answer. It's about the illusion of an answer, any answer, which is why Donnie will respond perpetually to any and everybody that responds to him or makes some video debunking some of the claims that he made. And then, that new video that he makes will say the same old thing. It'll make the same old arguments, but he'll at least be able to point to it and say, oh, I already responded to that. Creationists have the last word, therefore we're right. This is the Donnie Deals fallacy in action. So yes, it drives me crazy, but it's not the thing that drives me the most crazy.
I got you. Well, here in Dallas, we have the Institute for Creation Research, and they spend all this money. I'm sure you're familiar with the RAPE project.
Oh, yeah. I not only do I know the RAPE project forward and backward, William, but I read the RAPE project. I sat my stupid ass down and read the full volume 2 of the RAPE project. I didn't read volume 1 because that's just setting up their hypotheses. But, these were the guys that showed other young Earth creationists. They introduced this accelerated nuclear decay hypothesis because Andrew Snelling sat there and looked at rock after rock after rock. He's a young Earth creationist who's a geologist, for those of you who don't know. And he said, yep, it sure does look like 550 billion or, 4.5 or 550 million, or 4.5 billion years worth of radioactive decay has happened since creation.
Yeah, they admitted there was too much daughter. Yeah.
Yeah, there's too much daughter product.
They admitted there was too much daughter. Yeah.
And they can't say that the Earth was created with all of the isotopes in place and the rocks looking old because the flood is supposed to be responsible for the geologic column. So what, are we to believe that God had the flood sort everything so that it looks like the lower down layers are hundreds of millions of years older than the top layers? It is the ultimate just so story. There is zero hypothesis testing, and you're there in Dallas, you should check out the Institute for Creation Research's most recent claims on natural selection, because they are actually proposing, get this, that natural selection is not a thing. Institute for Creation Research has decided that that's too close to Darwin, that's too close to evolution. So they've proposed a new origin of species style mechanism to explain change in organisms over time. They call it CET, or continuous environmental tracking. And it's also bullshit. That will surprise nobody, but Randy Gugliuzza or whatever has been pushing it for a couple of months now over there in ICR.
Yeah, I took the tour. Eric Hoven's a friend of mine. And, he introduced me to Brian, one of the biologists on staff. These are not dumb people. I mean, he seemed very reasonable, very intelligent. I just don't understand when it just looks like they're pinned against the wall. They just will not give up, you know.
Well,
I think better are. Go ahead.
It's because I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, but I've looked at this myself as well. Like I specifically looked at it with Jason Lyle, the astronomer, right? Their astronomy guy, who's a young Earth creationist. But it's like, man, all you have to look at to know that they're not being persuaded by the data, they're going dogma first and then force-fitting the data to fit that dogma, is look at the number of people, the number of scientists across the world that have been convinced of young Earth creationism by the science instead of the conversion story, right? Instead of like their personal encounter with God that they say happened and that's intrinsically related to the young Earth creationism. You know, that's it. It's never, oh my goodness, when I look at the data, the Earth looks young. What's the only worldview that can accommodate this? Young Earth creationism, you know, in a Quranic sense or in a biblical sense, biblical literalist sense. Therefore, I will change to that religion. It is always the other way around. I say that there's probably like an exception out there, but you know, I can't think of an example where somebody was convinced by the data themselves and then made the conversion.
Well, now Donnie did say that he really respected you, and he, you know, liked that you presented cogent, intelligent arguments. They were very favorable to you. And do you think that even though you're not getting through to them, you might be getting through to the audience, their audience?
You know, William, I know that is true because I have the emails to prove it, right? I've had people who have emailed me and they've said, look, I wanted to thank you for the work that you've done because it's been helpful for me in delving into these creationist arguments and, you know, going into the nitty gritty of it, which, you know, that's the whole reason I do it. It's because like I did this myself and I want other people to have the resources available to do it too. You know, I mean, I know people who used to be young Earth creationists who feel like my channel has positively helped them or whatever my content, which, you know, I will never stop being wowed or flattered by that kind of thing, but whose minds do get changed. So like, it's not that it never happens, but somebody like Donnie is, I mean, he's complimentary to me because I cover his content a lot. And, you know, I think he's fun to engage with. I'll admit it, you know, take me away, officer. I will admit it. I like to fight with creationists on the internet. Book me. But I don't think he's the kind of guy that could be convinced. I really, really don't. I think there are people out there who are motivated for one reason or another to not be convinced. And there's nothing that I could ever say that would convince these people because, you know, where the rubber meets the road, as you were talking about earlier, you know, once you get them pinned to the wall, it can just be miraculous. I mean, that's what they go to every single time. That's what they've got. That's what they're moving towards with the heat problem. That's what like Rob Carter is sort of moving towards, not miraculous, but a common design type of thing with the human and chimpanzee genomic similarity being so high after Jeffrey Tompkins got BTFO'd. Like this is how it's going to go. They're going to be dragged kicking and screaming, just like they have been for the past century, into accepting bit by bit, piece by piece, word by word, sentence by sentence, modern biology. Just like Whitcomb and Morris, just like Duane Gish, just like Answers in Genesis. And the flock will continue to shrink and consolidate until, hopefully, creationism becomes, not a thing of the past, but very, very rare, I hope. As rare as flat Earth would be what I would like to see.
But let me ask you this. The progressive creationists that say the Cambrian revolution, explosion, whatever, that when we got echinoderms, chordates like us, arthropods, all these major phyla suddenly appearing, do you think the progressive creationists have a point?
I don't, because every single year, not even every single year, every single month, some guy that's studying the Ediacaran comes forward and they're like, I found this weird looking disc or this weird looking frond. You know, you're talking about Dickinsonia or some of these look annelid-like critters, that Charnia, the frond-like plant-looking things from the period of time that precedes the Cambrian. And these fossils are body fossils, and they're showing characteristics of these phyla that supposedly emerged suddenly during the Cambrian. So the fossil record continues to be an enemy of creationists of all kinds because it won't stop filling out. And the more it fills out, the more precursors we find. And the more precursors we find, the more gaps we fill in, the harder it is, to shove a progressive creation into those gaps. You can check out Jackson Weed if you really want to look into some of those Precambrian fossils that in fact show us that no, phyla do not. It is not the case. It is not accurate to say right now that all phyla or even most phyla appear suddenly and without precursors in the Cambrian. It's just not supported by the fossil record anymore.
Well, what we have here, from my perspective, is the layman's dilemma. I'm just a layman. I'm trying to figure this stuff out, just like the Professor Dave James Tour debate. When James Tour says, "Look, it's the chance of one protein forming and having the folding and the enzymes all is like 10 to the." Oh, he goes 10 to the 140. It's just a crazy number, which is basically saying it's impossible for these proteins and enzymes and so forth to come about by chance. Do you find these numbers compelling?
I don't, because I know what they do. And when I say they, I mean creationists like James Tour. I know what they do when they're taking these laws of large numbers or these, trends of large numbers and trying to apply them to evolution. And when they do that, they do it inaccurately. And in fact, I would go ahead and say that you can say that about James Tour in general, right? Like my experience with James Tour is when he talks about areas outside of his area of expertise of synthetic chemistry, places like evolution or origin of life, he makes mistakes. And he does not know the literature for evolution, certainly at all, right? And so, I'm sure you can trust James Tour to be a synthetic chemist. I'm sure he's a phenomenal synthetic chemist. He's got a ton of patents, and he's certainly made a name for himself in that field. Unfortunately, this is what happens when people talk outside of their area of expertise. You're saying here you've got like a layman's dilemma. You sound pretty informed to me, and I'll tell you what, I'm a layman in most things. Most people are. We can do our best, but that's why expertise exists. It's so that we know people who really know their stuff on a given subject. We look at what they say and the work that they've done, and we use that as at least a guiding starting point. So these probabilities of large numbers like that, or these arguments from large numbers or from probabilities, like you see with James Tour, I know when they talk about like evolutionary theory, they're basing this off of what are the odds of randomly getting, all of these mutations sequentially. Right? That is not how evolution works, right? Evolution isn't random, it's probabilistic, and natural selection certainly isn't random. And in addition to that, these mutations are occurring in sequence. Many of them occur in parallel at the same time, which obviously drastically cuts down on the time that it takes. So when I hear people talking about this with regard to origin of life, my first thought is this an accurate representation of what needs to happen? And the second that you look at what actual origin of life researchers are saying, it quickly becomes apparent that no, the argument is not being presented in an honest and an accurate way. It's a classic thing that you see from creationists like through time, and they still do it now, even still, right? That they make these arguments and they try to appeal to your common sense. They're like number big, evolution fake. Number big, abiogenesis fake. And it's like, that is just not how any of this works.
I love how William was whispering, I'm on the line.
Go ahead. Did you have a comment, Matt?
No, I was just noting that it made me laugh when you whispered to whoever, you were like, I'm on the line. And I was like...
But yeah, Stephen Meyer and the intelligent design people. Here's the other thing. What do you think? What James Tour will say is the chirality problem. If these amino acids, 19 out of 20 of them, have to be left-handed. So he thinks that's a killer. Do you think that's a killer, the chirality problem?
I don't. And, I'm not an origin of life researcher, and I really don't spend a lot of time on abiogenesis here online because it's just not my area of expertise. But I do remember looking into the chirality problem many years ago when I think I had a debate with somebody on like origin of life stuff. I think it was John Maddox. And those of you in the audience who remember logical, plausible, probable, it was quite some time since then. But I remember reading into the chirality problem, and I don't remember finding it compelling then. I simply don't remember finding it compelling. That's all the support that I can give you for now, because I don't really remember what the argument was or what the counters were to it. But I look back on it and I think that, if James Tour is the one saying it, and I hate to say this, I'm instantly more skeptical than I would be if somebody else was, because I know what James Tour is like. He's talking about things that he doesn't know very well. I just did a video on him a couple weeks ago where he's just like totally botching genetic studies. He mixes up ENCODE and he mixes up the 2005 chimpanzee studies and all this kind of stuff. But he will happily sit there and tell you till the cows come home that he's right on it. So I'm skeptical.
Well, he says time, as evolutionists who say time is the hopeful thing, where he would say time is your enemy, because these things, molecules decay, and if you don't watch them, they'll just decay. That time is actually your enemy. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard him argue that as well before, where he's like, oh, you need all of these things to happen, but these molecules are unstable in these early stages. And so how are we to suppose the right thing happened at the right time to make it so? But, I find that kind of odd as an argument to make, in part because I don't think anybody is actually proposing that. Right? Like my understanding of origin of life research isn't that anybody is saying, yeah, you have these unstable molecules that were, they only have a shelf life, if you will, of a couple of hours or a couple of days. And then, miraculously, thank goodness, boy, we sure were lucky. All the right steps happened to get us to, a protocell. Like, I don't think anybody is proposing that. I think that that's what James Tour is sort of painting the picture as. But to me, that strikes me as like a crocoduck style argument that you tend to see with creationists and evolution, where they're like, they want you to believe that a crocoduck is possible, but that's just absurd. It's like, yeah, but no one's saying that. Like no one is saying that is something that should even be. I mean, my understanding of the origin of life stuff too is that the test tube that you're working with is like a massive swath of the ocean, the massive portion of the ocean, either at hydrothermal vents or in little warm pools or what have you. And that once you get these reactions going, right, they sort of do in a way. I mean, chemical evolution is kind of a thing where things quote unquote want to be more stable. That things just aren't as improbable as he would have you believe, But again, it's been a while since I've looked into the abiogenesis stuff, and I'm sort of working, to be quite frank, off of my memories of having this conversation many years ago.
I've got to
you're
jump
not really
in,
a
William.
wet dryer or a venter. You don't know, right? You're either the vent, the warm vents in the ocean, or the wet dry. It seems to be divided, the origin of life people.
Yeah, and there's people who propose like the warm little pool as well. Like you've got sort of something analogous to like the Yellowstone hydrothermal vents, but not down in the deep, but at the surface. And I can't remember the name of the researcher who was doing work in the field on this, but I know there was one origin of life researcher who was like actually conducting these experiments at Yellowstone. Like basically, this is a crude analogy, but throwing a bunch of chemicals into these hydrothermal springs and then watching what happens. And if memory serves, his results were really fascinating and encouraging for origin of life in general. But that's all I can give you, because that's not what I study.
I got to wrap this one up,
you're
William.
So articulate. Go ahead.
I got to wrap this one up, William. We've got one more call we need to get to, and then Super Chat's
for everything you guys do, and you're so articulate and so knowledgeable, Erika. I really appreciate your help. Thank you.
Man, William, thank you. That's so kind. But clearly I'm not, because you're asking me abiogenesis questions. And I'm like, look, all I remember is the feeling that I had when I looked into this a couple of years ago. So thank you for the compliment. But please check out there are amazing people here online who are doing the original life research stuff. You can look to them, and I'm sure you'll find wonderfully detailed answers to all the questions you just asked me that I failed to answer. So call again and ask about it.
You guys are amazing. Thank you a lot. Bye.
Of course.
Thanks, William. See you later. I have questions, comments, and one more call we got to get to before we dig in on Super Chats. Evidently, see, I was really looking forward. There was a caller that was on hold, or that called in, and their call screen, their name was Gina, and they said that Matt is a chicken, and then told the call screener that I can't stand up to an honest to God Christian, a true believer, and then they hung up. So I'm wondering, who's the one who can't stand up, Gina?